Thank you for joining us for our media communications training with Johnna Miller. I am Valerie Huerta, Director of Communication for the New Mexico Farm and Livestock Bureau. I am the current coordinator for the Women's Leadership Program and our Young Farmers and Ranchers coordinator as well. I am pleased so many of you are able to join us for this training. In the course of our business, we're often asked by reporters our opinions on many issues. It helps us as ambassadors if we can give a meaningful answer without being nervous about speaking with the press. That's why we wanted to offer this educational opportunity to our membership. Now I'd like to introduce Darlene Hodnett, New Mexico Farm and Livestock Bureau's Director of Communications and Media Relations.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As our nation grapples with the effects of the coronavirus, public interest in food production and distribution has never been greater. Our state's farmers, ranchers, and dairy producers have become rock stars as the coronavirus has heightened awareness of the importance of local food producers. Media interviews are an excellent opportunity to grow the positive message of agriculture, and it's vital that when the phone rings, we pick up and share the story of ag. That's why I'm thrilled that Johnna Miller, Director of Media and Advocacy Training for the American Farm Bureau Federation, is with us today to provide some helpful tips when working with the media. Johnna started her career as a general assignment reporter for television stations in North Carolina and West Virginia, and she now uses her media background to design and offer media training, as well as advocacy and social media workshops. John is a Colorado native and graduated from Boston University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Broadcasting and Film. As you can see, she is well qualified for the area of advocacy. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Microphones are going to be muted just to reduce the background noise, but please utilize the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, type it in, and when John is done, we'll go ahead and answer all those questions at once. And now we welcome Johnna to share her expertise with us. Thanks, Johnna.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. Wish I was actually able to be in New Mexico because it's one of my favorite states to visit, but I'm happy that we're capable and able to have this kind of a virtual meeting despite all of the chaos that's going around. And I appreciate all of you guys taking time out of your day to really try and dig in and focus on being better advocates for agriculture, because as Darlene said, that's something that's so important to all of us. So I am going to share my screen here so that we will just dive right into all of the media training fun that it is. And it was interesting to see how you guys feel about this. I see a little bit of, oh, it's a little nerve-wracking, maybe not so confident. And I hope that with this, after we're done with this presentation, that you'll feel more confident and that you will be ready to do interviews and feel like you have a better grasp of how to prepare for that and make the most of those opportunities. So this little panel here at the bottom, I'm just gonna keep this here, you're not gonna miss anything major with that little black box back there. So I know it's there, but it lets me be able to work through and move around on the PowerPoint better. So first things first, why do Darlene and Valerie want you to do this? And it's just like Darlene said, it's really important for all of us in agriculture that we have folks who are willing and able to speak to the media about these issues. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today are skills and things that will also work when it's time for you to meet with lawmakers, when it's time for you to meet with folks at any kind of meeting at the Rotary Club. And you can take these skill sets and really apply them to a lot of things to make yourself the most dynamic speaker, but also getting to the point and sharing the information that's going to be most likely to persuade people to agree with you on whatever that topic is. And we know that it's really important to have members who are able to do that at American Farm Bureau, we get calls all the time where they don't necessarily want to talk to our lobbyists. They don't necessarily want to talk to President Duvall. They tell us we want to talk to a real farmer, a real person out there. And that's where you guys come in. The folks who are really affected by the different issues are the ones that they're really wanting to meet up with. And we like to be able to have folks on call that we know will do a good job when the media does call. You know, and part of that is that when they think about talking to staff people, I've had members say, well, isn't that what we have staff for? You know, as far as reporters are concerned, staff are great for just spilling the facts and giving you the overview, but they know that staff people, for the most, we're paid to talk about these things. We're paid to share this information, and so it doesn't have the impact that it would have if it was something that really affected us personally. Somebody who lobbies about estate taxes can never share as compelling a story as somebody who potentially is going to lose their farm or ranch because of the estate tax. And I think we all know that when we think about it, but sometimes when somebody's asking you to actually go do an interview with somebody and be on the spot, it's easy to say, oh, can't Delene do that? You know, can't Valerie do that? This is why Delene and Valerie are calling you up, because the media folks want to talk to those real people. And I want to make sure that you have a mindset, especially after this is all over, I want you to have a mindset that you see media opportunities as just that, an opportunity, not some ordeal that you're just trying to get over with and that you just want to say you did it and get it done. But if you think about it as an opportunity, it comes across one that you're more interested and eager to talk to that audience than if you are just like, oh, let me get this over with. People can perceive that. People can feel that when you're doing that interview. So you having that Zen mindset of, hey, this is a great opportunity to set the record straight on this issue or help people understand more about this issue, you are going to do a better job. So that's my first tip out of everything, is going into an interview with that correct mindset of, hey, this is an opportunity that's going to be great for me to be able to share this. So number one, that's what I want you to think about. So we will go over our big goals and objectives for this are to talk about just those basics of interviews so that you understand what the reporter's looking for, what is going to be best to help you prepare so that you have a message ready, so that you are not at the mercy of the reporter, but rather you are in control of what's happening in that interview. You know what your message is, you're able to deliver it, and you get that message across in the story. And then hopefully you'll feel confident enough that you will be able to deliver in that interview in such a way that that reporter is going to want to come back and talk to you again, and that those folks who read that story or listen to that radio report or watch you on TV, that afterwards they're like, wow, I understand where they're coming from on that. Oh, wow, that makes a lot more sense. I understand more why they feel so strongly about that, and maybe even, I agree with that, and I am going to support what they have to say about that too. Ultimately, you know, that's certainly what we would love to have happen every chance we get. That being said, when those reporters are coming out and talking to you, most folks really don't understand what it's like to be a reporter today. And this cartoon is very accurate as to what the average morning is like for reporters out there. They know a little bit about a whole bunch of stuff, but very rarely are they really digging in deep. Now, when there are national reporters here in Washington, D.C., yeah, we have folks who cover agriculture exclusively. And we have folks that maybe just cover taxes, and those folks who just cover the White House. But by and large, throughout the country, that's not what happens anymore. These newsrooms have smaller and smaller staff, and so it's very rare for there to be a reporter whose job is to be the agriculture reporter. Just don't see that like we used to see it. So that's something that you have to understand, that they really they might be doing a story on the economy tomorrow, on a car accident yesterday, but a story with you today. And so keeping that in mind, and it'll help you to be able to work with them better. Because these are the things that reporters care about the most. And I share this with you because I do think that if you understand what the hurdles that they face, what they're having to worry about every day, if you know those things, then you are able to work with them better. And let's face it, would you rather work with someone who makes your job easier or with someone who makes your job more difficult? I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? We'd all like to work with somebody who makes our job easier. And you understanding what that would be for a reporter is going to be helpful, because let's think about this also. If, let's say, you have done this interview and maybe you accidentally said billions when you meant to say millions. Now, if you have a good relationship with that reporter, they're going to say, you know what? I don't think that that's what Craig meant to say. I think he meant to say this other one. Let me call him up. Let me help him out. Let me make sure we got this right. Now, let me say that they don't have to do that. And if you're a jerk to somebody and you don't get along with somebody, sorry, I have cats running around here. I apologize. They just had dinner. They're a little feisty now. But so if that happens and you have a confrontational relationship with that reporter, they don't necessarily have to ask you to make sure if you got it right. If you said billions, then they can just trust that, hey, that's what they said, that's what they meant, and they don't have to double check with you. If you have a good relationship and you've been easy to work with and they're thinking about that, let me just double check. That is how having a good relationship can really work in your favor. So when we think about the things here and the ways that you can make a reporter's job easier, number one is really being understanding about their deadlines. So back in the day, I used to be a television reporter, and the deadlines were, truthfully, I still have stress dreams sometimes about whether or not I'm going to meet my deadline, whether I'm going to get my work done in time for the live shot that I have to be at. Because this is how their day goes. They come in the morning, they figure out what story they're working on, and then they might have to do something for the noon news. Then they're going to go out and they're going to gather the material that they have, probably on more than one story. They'll have one big story and one or two, maybe even three little smaller nugget stories. And they have to go out and get all of the video and interviews that are going to go along with that. Then they have to come back and they've got to edit that together to make it into the complete, what we call a package that you would see on the news each night. And then write up all those smaller versions and the longer version. And then they probably have to have a version for 5 o'clock, a version, something for 5:30, something for 6. They might have to do a live shot for the 6 o'clock news, which means they have to go out and be, on site to be able to do that story. And then they usually cannot go home until they've re-edited it and written something for the 11 o'clock news and for the morning shows to use. So it's a full day and you've got to meet all those deadlines. There's no option if you don't, because you cannot leave that empty space in the newspaper. You cannot leave that empty space in that television newscast. It is just unacceptable, And the thought of it just still makes me cringe to this day of ever having that happen. So how do you help them when that's their big concern? Well, you ask them, when is your deadline for this? Because I know that you're busy people and that you might be right in the middle of something and can't drop everything right at that moment when they might want to do a story with you or do an interview. So especially if you have a good rapport with somebody and worked with them before, you can say, okay, what is that deadline? When can we set this up that's going to work best for both of us? When I'm not right in the middle of something else here, let's figure out a time that's gonna work for everybody. Find out when that, they might have a little bit more leeway than they say they're gonna have. Also, so then they have every day, they have to come up with new stories every day. That's what their assignment editor's asking them. What do you got for me today? And that is pretty stressful too. Every day you've got to deliver something. And so you can help them because you know what these important stories dealing with agriculture are in a way that's just not obvious to other people. Most of these reporters don't have any kind of background in agriculture. Very few of them ever grew up on a farm. And so the things that are obvious to you are just not going to be obvious to them. So you have to share that, you know, what the situation is, how the meat packing plant, you know, having to shut down is having this ripple effect back on you. I mean, those were big stories, but those weren't obvious stories to all the reporters who covered those. Those became good stories because all these ranchers and organizations out there let them know this is a problem. You know, for those hog farmers out there who are used to being able to send their animals off to processing, but there was no processing plant open anymore, you know, the reality that they might have to, you know, use euthanasia on their animals was just something that most people would never have thought about. So you know those realities. When something is a story, you have to make sure that you're sharing that with reporters. That also is going to build a rapport with you, between you and that reporter. And let's face it, if you've built a rapport and you're somebody who gives them stories and story ideas regularly, that makes you such an important source that they're even less likely to do anything that's going to, you know, hurt you, or they're certainly going to give you a heads up if something's coming down the pike that might be a tough story, that you might really want to know about in advance. You're going to have that better rapport going there. You also are there to be good sources for them. Even if you aren't the right person to do a story on something, because of your agriculture and Farm Bureau connections, you know plenty of other people who could potentially be good for whatever story they're covering, who might have an estate tax issue that they're facing or whatever happens to be coming up in the news. You know people and you can help them out. That makes you a valuable resource. And then I really believe that it's important that we have to be there and be in stories. Otherwise, how are they supposed to be objective on something? If the agriculture side of the story doesn't want to talk, and it's the other side that's getting all the say, not only does that hurt us, because let's face it, that means that people are going to assume that we don't have a strong argument in that, but it also means that, you know, how can they be objective when both sides of the story aren't willing to talk to them? I think that's why American Farm Bureau really decided to ramp up their media training program, because we wanted to make sure that we were ready to talk about all the issues, even the tough stuff. Because years ago, when the estate tax was really coming up in Congress and they were talking about eliminating it completely, there was a ton of media coverage about this. And there was one reporter in particular who was covering it. And while you had the Warren Buffett and Bill Gates's dad on one side, and then really you had the Farm Bureau on the other side talking about this. And this reporter for the New York Times asked us at the Farm Bureau, hey, you guys say that the estate tax is potentially putting, you know, people off of their farms or ranches. Will you please put me in contact with someone who that's the case for? So we put the call out throughout the country, and no one would talk about this issue. No one. And that does not mean that New York Times didn't do a story. No, that became the story. The story was now one of the biggest proponents for getting rid of the estate tax can't find one single farmer or rancher to back their claims that it's putting them, you know, off their farms. It was a gut punch. And that's when we realized that there were just too many people who either didn't understand the importance of really making sure that our side of the story gets out there, or they didn't feel confident talking about an issue like that. So we decided that we needed to address both of those things. And that's why we have meetings like this, so that more folks do feel confident to do that. I also believe that it's really important that you know, covering agriculture can help a news station beat the competition. You can help with that. You know, agriculture is a big part of lots of places' economy, and covering that well when they have all the visuals that agriculture have is important. That being said, as much as I want you to cooperate with reporters out there, that doesn't mean that it's a good idea to do an interview just as soon as they call you. Now, think a minute. Why would that not be a good idea? Now, normally I would have you tell me, I would quiz you all and have you tell me why that's not a good idea. But in this scenario, it's not as easy to do. But that is because you obviously don't have your head in the game to be able to do the best interview possible when you haven't thought about this issue yet. They're just sort of dropping this in your lap. You're not going to be able to take advantage of that opportunity as well as you could if you would take a bit of time, gather your thoughts, maybe call up Darlene and say, hey, do you know this reporter? Is this somebody we've worked with before? Is there anything I need to know about him or her? Is there anything that they particularly seem to gravitate towards? Do they cover environmental issues more? Do they cover business issues more? Give you the intel on what they're normally covering, but it also gives you a time to develop the best messages for whoever their audience is. And we'll talk about doing that, some tools to do that in a little bit. One of the first tools, though, is knowing that when that reporter does call, you're not going to do the interview right that second, but this is a time for you to kind of go into reporter mode and ask them a few questions. Again, what's the deadline? How long is this going to take? Now, if it's a phone interview with the newspaper, it might take 10 minutes. It might take a half an hour. If they're coming out to your farm or ranch to do a video story with you for the evening news, then it takes longer. If you've never done that before, it just takes longer because they have to get all the video that they're going to use in that story, and just take for granted that that is going to be longer than you think it would normally take, because that's just the way the process is. This is also to find out, where is this story coming from? Is this because the state legislature is talking about doing something? Is this because the president tweeted about something? Is this because your neighbor down the road is complaining about something? Find out what's driving that story and think about how important that can be to know in advance. And also, who else are they interviewing? That can be really important to know, because think about the difference. If they tell you that they're interviewing the local extension agent, that's one thing. They tell you they're talking to Mercy for Animals, then it's a different type of story. And it gives you a much better idea of how you need to prepare for that story, depending on who it is that they're interviewing. Generally, what they're looking for from you is the farmer and rancher perspective. How is this affecting you directly? So that's pretty easy as far as that goes. What is the personal impact for you? Now, will they always answer your questions about who else they're interviewing or where they got the idea for the story? Maybe not. But most of the time I think they will, and it doesn't hurt to ask. And trust me, they're gonna ask questions that maybe you won't answer, but they're not afraid to ask those questions, so don't be afraid to ask. All right, question here. What is your objective? Now, looking at these 3 answers here, hopefully it's, most of you understand here and agree that this is the correct answer. Those of you who've done interviews before know that knowing the answer to all the reporters' questions, it's just not possible. And half the time, their questions aren't great. Let's be honest. As that cartoon showed, they don't necessarily know that much about the topic. They're cramming to understand this story, and really they don't have to generally dive in that deep on it. Newspaper folks have to dive in a bit deeper than radio and TV folks, but they're just trying to share it in a way that the audience understands it. So thinking about what's the audience going to know is really as much as the reporter needs to know and be able to share to. So that idea that the answers to all their questions, if the questions are crappy, what good does that do you if you know all those answers? As far as number 2 there, you don't want to sound defensive. You don't want to come across that way, because we know when somebody sounds defensive, people generally think that they're guilty, they've done something wrong. So we're going to avoid being defensive and getting into that mode at all costs. And so the idea there is, how am I going to get the audience to understand where I'm coming from, remember it, and agree with us and support what it is that we're saying needs to happen? That is your objective. That is your goal. How do I get whoever this audience is to agree with us? And let's face it, that is going to be different if it's the local small town paper, or if it's maybe the Albuquerque news station, or if it's the Denver newspaper calling you up. Those are going to be different depending on who the audience for that media outlet is. So you always got to keep that in mind. So your plan there is not just to be informing them of everything you know about a topic. I have to say that doing a lot of media training, a lot of farmers and ranchers go into that mode of, I'm going to tell you all about this. And that is not your job in the story. In fact, that's the reporter's job. The reporter's job is to share the relevant information. Your job is to persuade them of why your perspective on this is the one they need to remember, the one they need to understand, the one they need to support. So think about that. When you're thinking about what your message is for whatever the story is, what are you trying to persuade them of? What are you trying to convince that audience about? And then what is going to be the best way to do that depending on who they are? I suspect that folks in Santa Fe probably might be a little different audience than Las Cruces, right? So I'm speculating there, but I bet that's probably the case. And you might have your answers be a little bit different to appeal to those different audiences. All right, so I'm going to play a couple of examples here, and we're going to, about how persuasive these folks are. So hopefully you recognize that this here is the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, and this is an older clip from actually a Farm Bureau, Kentucky Farm Bureau event. And but it's during the Obama administration, and so he's talking about working with the Obama administration. So I want you to listen to this, and I want you to think about how persuasive he is.
By passing individual appropriation bills, you don't precipitate this sort of government-wide shutdown scenario, which really empowers the president. We're not going to do that, but it doesn't mean we're going to capitulate.
All right, so I'm checking now with Delene or Valerie to make sure that that the audio on that worked. Did that work for everybody to be able to hear that?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, good deal. So listening to that, go ahead. No, okay, so I'll keep going. So listening to that, most of the time people will listen to that and they'll basically be, what on earth is he talking about? And yeah, how can you be really persuasive when nobody knows what you're talking about? So he's talking to Louisville news stations, but he's talking to Louisville news stations as if they are people on Capitol Hill. I'm going to play it even one more time so you listen to it again.
By passing individual appropriation bills, you don't precipitate this sort of government-wide shutdown scenario, which really empowers the president. We're not going to do that, but it doesn't mean we're going to capitulate.
So basically, he forgot who his audience was. He forgot who he was talking to, and he's talking to Washington, D.C. people who are never going to see this, and he was not talking to Louisville people. And in reality, if that had been any of you, you'd have probably ended up on the edit room floor because they wouldn't have used it. But because he's Mitch McConnell, he's this most powerful man in Kentucky, they have to find something to use. And if that's the best thing that they could find to use, wow, that's pretty rough for sure. But now compare that to this. So this, you guys will probably recognize the guy, but this is back when California was getting ready to vote on a referendum about animal confinement. And so Oprah chose to do a story about this referendum for all the audience to help them make their mind up about it. And this guy was one of the guests.
This is just about basic decency. It's not a debate of vegetarianism versus meat eating. It's about if animals are going to be raised for food, and that's certainly the case in this country, then the least we can do for them is allow them to move. I mean, what's more basic than allowing animals with legs and wings to move around? So Prop 2 simply says that animals, these specific animals, veal calves, pregnant pigs, and laying hens, should be able to stand up, lie down, turn around, and fully extend their limbs. Now, we as a society, are we so miserly, are we so uncharitable that we cannot let these animals who make the ultimate sacrifice for us move around a little bit?
So whether you agree with him or like him or not, you pretty much have to agree that that's pretty persuasive. And compare that to what Mitch McConnell was doing. He's just talking like to regular people. He's not using a bunch of big words. He's not digging into the nitty gritty of what this referendum would do, because you know what? People don't care about the nitty gritty of what the referendum would do. So all he has to do is say, this is going to make it so that animals can stand up, turn around, and fully extend their limbs. I mean, that's pretty simple, right? That's easy to understand. And that's what these folks are going to say, that's all I need to know. And that's why this referendum, because they shaped it in that way, it had the highest degree of approval of anything that ever went through the California to California voters before. But he's also, the other thing I think it's important what he's saying is, notice he's speaking with a lot of feeling. So he's letting you know that he thinks this is important just by the amount of feeling and the passion in his voice. So think about that. If you sound as laid back as Mitch McConnell did, I, as the viewer, if you don't come across as seeming like that is important and it's your issue, why am I sitting at home having my, hamburger helper gonna pay attention if you don't seem more interested in that? So think about that and how you portray through your voice, through your inflection, through your eye contact, how important you think a topic is. So we also know that shared values are really the powerful way to convince folks on any topic out there. So the Center for Food Integrity did some polling and research on this, and they found that shared values brought people to trust folks on an issue 3 to 5 times more than somebody who knew all the facts about something. So you may know every fact under the sun. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to trust you. However, if you have values in common with me, I am way more likely to trust you because we have that in common. And I like to think that somebody who has these common values with me is going to be a more trustworthy person. We've really done some work too and realized that for so many of the issues that deal with agriculture, the things that we can find shared values on no matter where folks live. It could be San Francisco, California, or wherever you are in New Mexico, but you should be able to find shared values on the health of your family, so them having healthy food to eat. Folks in Berkeley want that just like you do. It may look different to both of you, but it is something that you both value, and you can talk about that in a way that helps you be understood there. We all want clean air. We all want clean water. We all want a good environment. We can find that, again, that may look different to you, but you have found a common ground there, and you can help somebody see it from your perspective that your goal is the same. You just might be approaching it from a different way, but your way may still be really effective, even though they might not have considered it before. And that's a way for them to trust in you more because they see, yeah, they really do want to help with water quality or whatever the case may be. And then the third big one that we found is animal welfare, that, we should all be able to agree that we think animals should be treated humanely. And again, that may look really different if you don't understand, why a veterinarian is doing something a certain way. But maybe once you understand that, when you know that, hey, I'm doing this because this is the humane thing to do, and that the research has backed that up, and my personal experience shows that this is what works. Again, finding that common ground there is going to build trust with different groups. So that again goes back to thinking about who is the audience you're talking to. Who are they? And what shared values on whatever the issue is might we have in common with most of the people who are watching this show tonight, or who are going to read that article tomorrow morning. So thinking about your audience, that is going to help you find the most powerful messages that are going to be persuasive for that story. So one of the tools that we use for that is the message house. So in the handouts that you guys got, if you printed those out, or if you want to look at if you already did, look at those. So the message house is something that we came up for our Partners in Advocacy Leadership Program is a tool to help figure out what messages to share during an interview, because we know a lot of stuff about a topic. How do we narrow it down to the 3 big points that are going to be most persuasive for that audience? That's where the message house comes in. So what is that main message? That main message, what am I trying to persuade this audience about? What am I trying to persuade them about? And these are all the things that you might use to do that. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use all of these or have one each of these. These are just some of the powerful, some powerful information that you can use to help convince people. So we've got the shared values in there. I want you to always try and think about, what are the shared values? That's the way you're going to build trust with the audience so that they believe in you. On the other right-hand side, you should also always try and find your personal story. What personal story can you share about how this affects you and why it's a big concern or why it's a big deal? Tell that personal story. That's why the reporter has come to you, because you have a personal story. So think about how to weave that in and tell that story in the course of being persuasive about the issue. Convincing analogies where you can take something that maybe I don't really understand and I can't grasp because I don't, I didn't live on a farm perhaps, so that understanding how something works is difficult for me. Finding an analogy that makes sense to them, that they can relate to it better, is really powerful. So the one that I'll throw out there is, I've got to admit, I grew up in agriculture country. I grew up in Weld County, Colorado, which is a top 10 cash receipts county. But I had never really understood this idea that farmers would go into debt and risk it all, hoping that they had a good crop coming out the next year, and then would get paid for that later, and not know how they were going to get paid for that. That had never crossed my mind. So how do you share that in an analogy? Well, you might share that, what's the closest thing for me for that? Well, that would be my salary and the average person, their salary out there. So maybe the idea of explaining to it, can you imagine what it would be like that you don't know what your salary is going to be every year? You just spin a wheel and see where the arrow falls, and that's what salary you're going to get that year. And that's how you have to figure out how to live for the year ahead by whatever that dial landed on. Well, that's what it can be like to be a farmer out there, and hope that the weather and that the prices and everything else, works in your favor, so that you get, have a good salary, or and you're not, below water, So that's an example of an analogy you might use. The WIIFM, what that stands for is what's in it for me. And in this case, this is just a reminder of thinking about what the audience cares about. Why would the audience care about this issue? Why might the audience be on their side? What's in their interest for this to work out? Sometimes I talk about, when again, I keep going back to the estate tax, but that's because we talk about it a lot at AFBF. But the idea that if the estate tax is putting these farmers out of business, that land's going to get gobbled up by real estate folks, and it's going to end up being, mini malls and strip malls and housing developments all over. And does everybody really want New Mexico to be covered with strip malls and housing developments all over? I mean, there's a certain part of most folks that they love and appreciate the open spaces that make their state special and great. And so trying to tie into that as to how they want their state to be preserved, and how you might tie that to the estate tax is an idea of thinking about the what's in it for me there. So here's an example of how we would use that back when the Farm Bill was the big issue that we were talking about. Notice that, that top headline is not, oh, we need a new Farm Bill. Too many people have bad negative connotations about the Farm Bill. So we don't want to be talking about that necessarily, because automatically we're having to dig our way out of a hole, because so many people, all they think about are the subsidies of times gone by, and that's what's entrenched in their brains. So instead, we talk about farmers needing a safety net. You know what? Most people will agree with that. Just right off the bat, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, farmers do need a safety net. Well, why is that? Well, because it's, one of the weather has such a strong component of whether it's going to be a good year or not, or crop insurance is so important, whatever the case may be. And these are the different examples that you might use for your personal story, or for the shared values that you have to make a good message house out of talking about the Farm Bill. All right, so Soundbites, that for some of you, maybe some of you know what a soundbite is, but others might not. So a soundbite technically is in a TV or radio story where you hear the real people. So those little clips where you hear the farmers, the ranchers, or whoever who's not the reporter, those are called soundbites. And so they're pulling those out of your interview and sprinkling them in the story. And so you want to give them good sound bites. So you have to think about that. What is short and snappy that is going to appeal to the reporter, and so that they'll share that with the audience? So they need to be short. They need to be simple. The average soundbite these days is about 7 seconds long. So that means a good chunk of them are 3 seconds, and a good chunk of them are about 12 seconds, and 7 being the average. And I have people all the time say, how do you come up with an effective, compelling, convincing, persuasive soundbite in only 7 seconds? And the example I always use here is Johnny Cochran. Now, if there's young people on this Zoom, you might not have any idea who Johnny Cochran is, which is tough for me because I keep looking for a better example than his, and I still haven't found one. If any of you can think of one, please send it to me via email. But those of you who do remember, those of you who don't, Johnny Cochran was the lawyer who represented O.J. Simpson in his first trial. And he came up with that famous line, if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. And it's been more than 20 years, but most people who were alive during that time and watching the news, if I say that soundbite, they know immediately what I'm talking about. They know immediately who said it. So I would say that that's a pretty successful soundbite. And you can say it in about 3 seconds. And it told the entire story of what his case was. And I'm sure you all realize, once you think about it, that he didn't just come up with that at the spur of the moment in front of the jury, right? He thought about it. And you can just maybe picture him at home, figuring out what he's going to say to the jurors the next day, and thinking about I have to convince them that OJ could not have committed this murder. And my most compelling evidence for that is that these bloody gloves don't fit his giant running back hands. So he takes that chunk of information and compresses that down to if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. I mean, he is a brilliant orator, and for some people, coming up with sound bites will be easier than others, but oftentimes they're a work in progress. And so it's like that chunk of coal that you will just compress down and make it a little better each time, so that eventually it'll become that great diamond that you can use on whatever the topics that you're getting interviewed on frequently. So I'm going to share a couple of examples here. So this, I think, is really a great metaphor. And so this guy used to be the Secretary of Transportation. He was also a congressman in Pennsylvania. And now he works for a transportation organization, NGO. And so listen to this soundbite.
Our infrastructure's on life support right now.
Our infrastructure's on life support right now. Now that is so powerful, because when he compares it to being on life support, that gives us so much more information than him just saying, oh, it's terrible, right? He could say, oh, it's horrible, it's terrible. But all of that is relative. My terrible versus your terrible, you know, what does that mean exactly? But we all know what life support means. It's concrete. We understand it. And we know that that means things are at as serious a level you can get to without it being all over, right? So that was just really effective way to help people understand the severity of it by using a metaphor to help people get it.
Our infrastructure's on life support right now.
We hear you. All right. Superlatives and extremes are also always, a reporter's always going to pull those out. Anytime that you can say something is the most, the least, the best, the worst, that's more memorable, and that's something that they're going to want to use. So think about that. Is there something in the issue that you're talking about that is the worst, the best, or close to it? That you could share that would be of interest. That's something that they're going to remember when folks are talking about a story the next day, or something with that little bit is going to end up on Twitter or Facebook. They're going to save that little blurb and share that over and over again the next day. All right, so this blurb I'm going to share, I'll share it first. So, well, you might remember this is back when there was the oil spill down in the Gulf of Mexico when the platform exploded, and 11 people died during that explosion. And BP is trying to deal with what's continuing to be a flow of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And here's their top guy talking about that.
We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, you know, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back.
I'd like my life back. Well, that honestly, that cost him his job. You can't say, I want my life back when 11 people died. And it just sounds pretty self-absorbed and pretty selfish. You know, it's not all about you, buddy. It's about all the people whose businesses have been ruined. It's about those people who, you know, whose family members died. So that's what I want you to remember, that the idea of what does it matter to the audience. So when I hear farmers and ranchers talk all the time about, well, here's what it means to my bottom line. You know, here's what it means to my profitability. And do you think that the folks in the audience care that much about your bottom line or your profitability? Most of the time, they don't. And so think about a better way that you can talk about that's going to make it something that they will care about. Protecting the land, protecting you know, the open spaces, something along those lines that they are more, or even if it's a matter of, you know, fairness, you know, that they're trying to, you know, take over my property for, you know, for eminent domain or something. And so you got that element of, boy, it's so unfair that what's happening here. You know, that might get folks in on your side on that too.
We're sorry for.
All right, so I did realize that sometimes I would do the media training, and I know some of you are going to do these interviews afterwards, and folks, I'd ask them a question and they'd give me this short answer, and then they'd just look at me, and I'd be like, I need a little bit more than that. And say, but Johnna, you said short, snappy sound bites. And I realized, yes, I did say that, didn't I? So I wasn't explaining very well the difference between answering, giving an answer to a question and the sound bites in there. So you can answer a question with several sound bites and link those sound bites together. So I started thinking about your answers as a stack of Legos. And the reporter can pull those apart potentially, and to each Lego being like its own soundbite. So looking at this, if they ask me some lame question, hey, Johnna, how bad's the drought? And my answer could be, this is the worst drought I've seen since we started farming. We haven't seen a trace of a promising cloud in months. And, even if we got rain tomorrow, our harvest is still only going to be about half of normal. And you know what? There's just nothing I can do about it. So that's one answer, but potentially 4 sound bites. Hopefully, normally I can see people, whether they're nodding their heads and telling me, yeah, I get it. So I hope you're getting that. The idea that you want it to be these nice short bits that stand alone and make sense by themselves and build together to make the story. Maybe the other way to think about it is chicken nuggets. So, you want the whole meal, but you want it one little chicken nugget at the time, not like shoving the whole chicken down your throat. So make sure that the bits of your answer can all sort of stand alone, that it's not one long drawn out thought that's hard to follow, that you take it one piece at a time and explain it. So this is an example, I think, where she has several Legos, as I like to call it, in here. So some of you may recognize Stephanie Smallhouse. She's currently the president of the Arizona Farm Bureau. Years ago, she was in our Partners in Advocacy Leadership class. And so I followed what interviews she's done, and she sent me interviews that she's done over the years. And this was one about the WOTUS issue that she did several years ago when that topic first came out. So I want you to listen for the Legos in here.
What does this water mean to your family? And then what is in your mind, the government trying to do?
Well, to my family, we have to have water to grow food. I mean, that's the way it is for every farmer and rancher. If we can't use our water and we have to go through permitting and paperwork to get it, we won't last that way. When it's time to plant a crop, it's time to plant a crop. When it's time to move cattle, it's time to move cattle. We can't wait 3 weeks, a month, a year for a permit for something that is ordinary for us, something that we need to do every day. My kids are 6th generation, and the goal for my husband and I is that 20 years from now, they'll be farming the same farm and moving cattle on the same land. And the EPA is not wanting us to do that, apparently.
All right, so hopefully you could hear those different little Legos, but how they all fit together and how easy they would be to pull apart to create a story. So that was just one answer in what was an interview that had like 4 more questions to it. But realistically, just in that one answer, she had enough sound bites for any reporter out there to be able to do a story on the WOTUS issue from her family's perspective. So, think about how she fit those all together to tell her whole story. Also, notice she didn't just answer the question, she told the story. She set the narrative out there. So you're not there just to answer those reporters' questions. You're there to use that opportunity to share the story and persuade the audience. 2 different things there, not just answering their questions, but sharing the information that you want to share that's going to be most persuasive. All right, so back in the day, before I became a full-time trainer, I used to do videos and podcasts for the American Farm Bureau, and I used to wish that all of the economists and lobbyists would come down and be ready to answer these questions for me and have done their message house. It did not happen very often. And I was always so thrilled when it did. But if you think about when you're starting that interview, almost no matter what question they throw at you, if you're ready to answer these questions right off the bat, to say, well, here's why this is such a big issue. Here's why the audience should care about this. Here's what needs to be done about this. And here's why we're correct and those people are wrong. Or here's what's going to happen if this doesn't happen. This is going to be the result of that. Here's how it's going to affect the state of New Mexico if this doesn't work out. Don't wait for the reporter to ask you those things, because what if they don't? Then you will have not gotten to share an important piece of your story. So you just go ahead and lay all of that information out there, hopefully in your very first answer. And you have there set the stage where it's probably going to have an impact on what questions they're going to ask next, because their questions are probably going to shift compared, from what you have shared with them. And now suddenly you're in charge of what this story is going to look like, or at least more in charge of what this story is going to look like, despite whatever their preconceived notion of what the story was going to be before. Jargon is something that agriculture is a jargon-rich environment. So you're trying to communicate with an audience. And if you're using words that they don't understand or that they think of differently, then you're not communicating with them well. So one of those words that we use all the time, and that it's fine if you're using it in a Farm Bureau meeting, and it's fine if you're using it at the USDA, but otherwise, don't talk about yourself as a producer. When they hear the word producer, they think Steven Spielberg. They are not thinking of farmers or ranchers. Farmers and ranchers have some of the top approval ratings of any occupations out there. So why make this more difficult? Let's use the words that everybody knows and that they respect. Operation is another one. When folks think of operation, folks outside of agriculture, they're thinking of surgery, of military campaigns, or the funny bone game. They are not thinking about your farm or ranch. So call it a farm or ranch. Make it as easy for them to understand all these things as possible. And so when you were working on your message house, look and see, do you have any jargon in there that either you can find a simpler way to say it, or that you then need to explain what that means as simply as possible? So keep that in mind. Keep in your mind the idea that you want to use language that they understand versus what you say all the time. If they're talking to them in a foreign language, you're not doing any good. So this goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. Your good answers are way more important than just answering their questions. As long as you're giving them good answers that make for a good story, they're not going to care that you didn't directly answer the question the way they meant it, unless you're talking about something that you just don't want to talk about because it's too hot a topic, then they're not going to let you get by with that. But generally, as long as what the information you're sharing is good and valuable to the story and making for an interesting story, that's what they care about. On your worksheets, you also have some bridging language there. Now, this can be really helpful to help you steer that so that you're not just answering the question and you're steering it to the information that you want to share. So look at some of those statements and how you can use that, where it's like, well, Johnna, that's a really interesting point, but what I think is more important is this point over here. Or, some people would say that, but my experience on my ranch is that this is what happens. So think about how you can bridge to the things that you want to talk about that are on your message house. And I hope that those of you who are doing interviews after this might be madly working on your message house as we talk about this and getting some tips about that. Just saying. All right, a couple of examples. So this, I feel so bad for Lincoln Chafee in this one because it's just harsh. But this is when during the last presidential election, and you may not remember this, but Lincoln Chafee actually did run for the Democratic nomination. Didn't last too long. But let's listen to, and you'll see why it didn't last too long. But I think that he takes what is a really rough premise of a question and makes it about as positive as he can with what he has to work with.
Here's how two major newspapers reviewed your performance last night. The Washington Post titled their article, "How to Disappear Completely" by Lincoln Chafee. The Boston Globe called it Lincoln Chafee's No Good, Very Bad Night. Here's what worries me, Governor, that because of your distinguished career, you're going to wind up looking silly if you keep going on like this. At what point will you decide, you know what, there are other things for me to do instead of a futile effort to try to get the Democratic presidential nomination?
Well, that was certainly a lesson last night to appear there and only get 9 minutes out of 2 hours. And it reaffirmed what I thought when I got into the race, and that the establishment just does not want to hear an anti-war voice. And that motivates me even more to continue this campaign. And yes, I've had a distinguished career. I've served at all levels of government. I've been a United States Senator and a governor. But these issues are so important, and I want to continue to raise them. And I will.
So think about that. So he turned it, he took what was really a tough premise of a question. Obviously, or I believe that he knew this question was coming. When you've got all those headlines on the paper and that's all the buzz that everybody's been saying about you, you know that Wolf's going to ask you about that. So he thought about it. Hey, how am I going to take that and shift it to something positive that I want to talk about? And I thought he did that very effectively, and then went on, he repeated the positive things that Wolf Blitzer said about having a very distinguished career. It's like, hey, that's right, I do. And so he highlighted the things that were good, and then he shifted the negative to how it worked best for him. So on some of the issues that you talk about, what some of the tough questions are going to be. When we're talking about the farm bill, we know subsidies to farmers is going to come up. We just know that. So think about, how are you going to bridge from what they're saying to what it is that you want to talk about? This is something you can plan ahead for. And that's what
here's how two major news.
Keep doing that. Now, this is not bridging. So this is when Rick Scott, this is before he was maybe this is when he was running for Senate. Or it might have been when he was running for governor the second time. I'm not even remembering which. But back when he was on the campaign trail, he had some folks who got up on stage and were actually at his campaign rally in uniform. So they were on-duty officers in uniform, and that is actually against the law unless you're there for for there to do security or something. So he's getting asked about that.
Did you really think that all of those deputies were off duty?
I'm very proud that last week the police chiefs endorsed me. I'm very proud that 40 sheriffs have endorsed me. I'm very proud of all the support from the law enforcement. We're at a 43-year low in our crime rate. So we invite them to our campaign events, and I'm very appreciative of the ones that came.
But did you think it was a problem to have on-duty law enforcement there?
I'm very appreciative of both their support and those that come to my events.
You didn't answer that question. Should there be discipline?
Look, I'm appreciative of everybody that comes to my events. And gosh, we're at a 43-year low in our crime rate. We should be very supportive of our law enforcement.
So do you think it's okay for them to be there on duty?
I'm very appreciative. Our police chiefs endorsed me last week, the association. 40 sheriffs did. We have law enforcement that come to a variety of events and others. And I'm very appreciative of anybody that comes to an event and supports my race.
Ouch. I mean, come on, that's painful, right? That's painful to watch. So it's a valid, legitimate question. It's the top story of the day. You're not going to get by with just this one little soundbite repeated over and over again. So how do you deal with that? That's the time when you say, you know what? That's something that our campaign is looking into, and we'll get back to you when we know more about it. That way you've addressed it. but you really haven't said anything. You've addressed it. And then you go to saying, but in the meantime, we're so glad to have support from all these, these law enforcement, and that crime rate has gone down. So you address it briefly and then move on to what it is that you want to talk about. I'm going to skip that one. Hold on. So another point here, and it's a trick that reporters can use sometimes, where they will, and that's kind of what Wolf Blitzer did, where he kind of threw out there the idea of, this was just a no good, very bad night for you. What do you have to say about that? And give you the premise of sort of negative words for you to repeat. You don't want to repeat those. That should be like a whoop, 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 red light going off. You see on your handout some of the ways that you can shift from using negative language to using positive language. So if I ask you, hey, why are you polluting the stream that runs through your ranch? You don't want to say, oh, we don't pollute the stream. Because I'm going to use, we don't pollute the stream, and the first thing that's going to be in my story. And how does that sound? It sounds defensive. So instead, you switch that around to positive language, and you say, we take conservation and the environment really seriously, and we work so hard to protect all the waterways in our area, and we have buffer strips or whatever. So you go to the positive and ignore the negatives. So this next example is, I got permission to use it. So this is the former president of Mississippi Farm Bureau, although this was before he was the president. And I'm asking him in media training about an issue that happened years ago in California, where a video of a downer cow being forklifted went out on the news, and it was a big spiel. And I'm asking him about that.
We've seen these videos lately, and they've been of dairy cows basically being tortured. You as a dairy producer, what do you think of that?
Well, I know on our dairy farm, we try not to torture our cows.
We try not to torture our cows. Not good. Not good at all. So I fed him that word torture, and he fell right for it. And he repeated that word. Instead, and this is a guy who had actually won awards from the State Veterinary Society for taking such good care of his dairy cows. So, that's when you say, hey, it's the most important thing to us to take care of our animals, and take it from there. Go to the positive, avoid the negatives. All right, last but not least here, it's the difference of attitude and how you treat a question and how you deal with it can make so much of a difference on how it's going to end up in the story and how you come across. You do not want to come across as defensive. It just doesn't look good. And so I have this almost was made for media training, because the president and the vice president are asked the same question by the same reporter, and it's pretty fascinating to see the difference in how they handle that.
What do you say the Americans were scared, though? I guess nearly 200 dead, 14,000 who are sick, millions, as you witnessed, who are scared right now. What do you say to Americans who are watching you right now who are scared?
I say that you're a terrible reporter. That's what I say. I think it's a very nasty question, and I think it's a very bad signal that you're putting out to the American people. The American people are looking for answers, and they're looking for hope. And you're doing sensationalism, and the same with NBC and Comcast. I don't call it Comcast. I call it Comcast. Let me just add, for whom you work. Let me just say something. That's really bad reporting. And you ought to get back to reporting instead of sensationalism. Let's see if it works. It might and it might not. I happen to feel good about it, but who knows? I've been right a lot. Let's see what happens, John.
Can I get back to the science and the logistics area? The units that were ordered.
So what's interesting is, like the president says, the people are looking for, hope, and they're looking for something to believe in. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. So why didn't you give that to them? This was your opportunity, an opportunity to put forward your message to help people feel more confident about it. And Mike Pence, that's what Mike Pence did.
Vice President, you're the head of the task force. You've seen the numbers. You've spoken to average Americans. You're a former governor. What do you say to Americans right now who are watching and who are scared?
I would say, do not be afraid, be vigilant. All the experts tell us that the risk of serious illness to the average American for the coronavirus is low. But we need every American to put into practice the president's coronavirus guidelines, 15 days to slow the spread, because the coronavirus is about 3 times more contagious than the flu, according to our best estimate. And you can contract the coronavirus, have very mild symptoms, if any, not even be aware that you have it, and expose someone who is vulnerable to a very serious health outcome.
So there, I mean, I think that's pretty obvious in the difference there. And thinking about the reassurance and what the audience is going to perceive from that, you know, taking politics out of it completely. If you're just somebody who is home and worried about the virus, think of your reaction to the defensive answer versus the reaction to the reassuring answer. You want to be the reassuring person. Most folks don't have people that are as big as supporters behind them or as virulent supporters behind them as President Trump does. So you want to make sure that you're the person who's easier to support there. And in this case, that's certainly Vice President.
What do you say to Americans who are scared, though, I guess?
Sorry. So last but not least, you are often going to get these last questions, these final questions in an interview that a reporter will throw at you just at the end. And so be ready for those. Be ready for something. If there's some hot news that's come up that has to do with agriculture, if the president tweeted something about farmers, you know what? That may get thrown at you at the very end. While I've got you here, let me ask you, what do you think of that, you know, what Trump said about the farmers? Be ready for that. You know, and even if it's being ready of, you know, you're not going to answer that, be ready with how you're going to deal with that, you know, so that you just, you know, you're going to bridge. You know, I really don't follow the president's Twitter feed, but what I do know is that we appreciate any president who's looking out for the farmers, you know, and take it from there. And then the last thing is there anything else you'd like to add? Now, you should always answer this. Now, and this is not coming with some, you know, question out of the blue that you're going to give them. You're going to think back to what is on your message house. And is there anything that you didn't mention that was on your message house that you didn't talk about? If there is, here's your chance to get it out there. Is there one message that above all you want to make sure everybody understands? This is your chance to say it again. And maybe this is the time that you say it really well. And it's easy for the reporter to find it because it's the last thing you said. Oh, yep, he said something really great there. Just go use the last thing that he said in the interview. So always think about reiterating your message one more time and just really drive it home to make sure you get your point across. A few things with just how to, these days when we have so many more Zoom calls and video interviews out there, folks are doing Skype interviews with news media all the time. We'll think about how to look. Obviously, this is problematic. So don't wear any really tight stripes or checks because it does crazy things with the camera. Also, it's generally problematic to wear white because it makes, you know, your skin, it darkens up your skin and it's not as flattering. Black's a little bit better, but still white and black are not friends for cameras that way. So try to have something more in the middle there that you can share. Don't be sitting back like this because nobody looks good when all of this is showing. It's just, I don't know, maybe Brad Pitt, but that's about it. So looking forward a little bit, your chin out, that makes everybody's jawline look a little bit better. And who wants to not look better? And think about what background are you showing when you're doing a Skype interview? or even if you're on a Zoom call. Nowadays, you know, the Secretary of Agriculture is doing Zoom calls with people all the time. Maybe you're somebody who gets to answer the question of that. You want to just look as good and professional as possible. So I compare these two, you know, just look at the difference here. This is Larry Sabato, who is a political commentator and professor at University of Virginia. For God's sakes, don't ever appear in any kind of room like that, because all anybody's going to be doing is thinking and looking about what a complete disaster your room or your shop or whatever is. So pick something that is less distracting, and so that people will pay attention to what it is that you're saying, the content of your interview versus all the chaos in the background. All right, and I'll turn it back over to Valerie or Delene.